of Fanon's previous self as he begins to move through this that no matter how well he speaks French, the goal analytic grounding for understanding the phenomena of colonization, but which dramatically misses the point, which, if you remember, diagnoses a sort of inherent complex in the colonizer, a Prospero complex of wanting to prove themselves through dominating others, but also a dependency complex among colonized people, which seeks to identify a need to be dominated, a need to be colonized, right? And Fanon says that sort of quite paradoxically, Manoni has missed the point by failing to center colonization itself, right? The rupture point, that is the colonial encounter, the before and after that should, if you're trying to take seriously again, in Fanon's framing of a sociogenic analysis, what kind of social structures generate psychological complexes, you would begin, you would think, from the most fundamental one for the colonized world, which is the process of colonization itself. Those are things that we talked about last week. Again, attempts to escape from, to overcome, to ignore and transcend the fundamental reality of colonialism and racialization. And again, now we get into chapter 5, which, as I've said repeatedly, is the heart of the book, is the heart of Black Skin, White Masks. Let's see if I can get it to work. Which charts I'll just do it this way. The turning point, as we've mentioned, the shifting, the point of inflection, the breaking point in Fanon's own consciousness, after which he is a different person entirely. Remember that in the introduction, Fanon had already said this. He said, as he puts it, that the Black person in chapter 5 that he describes has, quote, nothing in common with the Black person in chapters 1, 2, and 3, and the white masks they're tempted to wear. Instead, here's what he calls, again from the introduction, quote, the Black man confronted with his race, striving desperately to discover the meaning of Black identity. And here in this passage, you see these clear Du Boisian references, right? Both in the striving and in the souls. You know, the sort of previous message, the previous suggestion that the souls of Black folk, in Du Bois's phrase, are constructs, as he puts it, of white society. Again, when Fanon says the person confronted with their race, the person who has nothing in common, this is not just any person, but it's Fanon himself. And Black Skin, White Masks tracks his own journey toward a kind of self-consciousness, which is a classic existential, dialectical, philosophical category, through a process that he calls, in a kind of more specific and particular language, disalienation. Right? This is a phrase he's going to say repeatedly and mention, and he had already mentioned in the introduction. Now, I mentioned 4 main influences last week. I spoke about dialectics, about radical psychiatry, about existentialism, and about negritude poetry and the broader negritude movement. One that I didn't mention explicitly, but which is worth bearing in mind and which often goes hand in hand with existentialism, but operates a little differently, is very important for this chapter, and that's phenomenology, phenomenological analysis. We always try to emphasize at Abolition School that we don't want you to get caught up in complicated sounding words and terminology. We care much more about things than about words. So what is the thing here that we're trying to describe when we say phenomenology, or Fanon uses those terms? What's worth knowing is that many existentialists, like Sartre, for example, do phenomenology as well. But while existentialism is and tends to be more concerned with the question of analyzing our freedom to make authentic decisions from within the situation that we're thrown into against our will, that's the sort of existential situation. By contrast, phenomenology can be understood as a method for analyzing our experience of that situation, right? The objects we confront, the structures we confront, the people that we interact with in that situation. So you can do a phenomenological analysis, which we're going to see this is exactly what Fanon is doing. Chapter 5 is a phenomenological analysis of what he calls the lived experience of anti-blackness. Here he says in French, expérience vécue. It's a translation of the German term Erlebnis, which is a key phenomenological term. And once again, we're not talking about just any experience, but we're talking about his experience. Now, the first English translation of Black Skin, White Masks made a very serious and very sort of well-known mistake when it comes to translating the title of this chapter. If you have the first edition in front of you, that translation refers to this chapter as the fact of blackness. While this decision might make sense on some level, Fanon does in fact confront anti-blackness as a fact, if not the central fact, of his own world of experience. To describe blackness or anti-blackness as a fact strips away, or risks stripping away, all of the dynamism that we're going to see in Fanon's experience of it, his confrontation with it, and the complex dialectical path that he begins to chart through it, beyond it, right? So there's a dynamism that is not reflected in the idea of the fact of blackness. Now, Fanon has already told us that the black-white binary is a sort of double narcissism, that he understands blackness as an affective psychological disorder, and that his own cry will not be what he calls a black one. This chapter will be the key to tracking how and why Fanon arrives at this position, and in fact, what it means. And it begins with the accurate translation of the title that we have here, the lived experience of the black man or the black person, l'expérience vécue du noir. What is the nature and the content of that lived experience is what Fanon's going to begin with. It begins, as you see on the first page of the chapter, with the most brutal forms of racism, racial overdetermination, slurs that I won't repeat here. But again, we're less interested in the fact of the first line, but the dynamic process that it sets in motion. So you'll see it begins with a slur and then suddenly a sort of cascading of analysis, of understanding. This dynamic process that it sets into motion takes many complex twists and turns, and they begin right away with his orientation, right? Immediately after the racial slurs that he himself is confronting, he writes, "I came into this world anxious to uncover the meaning of things, my soul desirous to be at the origin of the world, and here I am, an object among others, an object among other objects." Locked into this suffocating reification, I appealed to the other so that his liberating gaze gliding over my body, suddenly smoothed of rough edges, would give me back the lightness of being I thought I had lost, and taking me out of the world, put me back into the world. But just as I got to the other slope, I stumble and the other fixes me with his gaze, his gestures, his attitude, the same way you fix a preparation with a die, meaning like a microscope slide. I lost my temper. I lose my temper, demand an explanation, nothing doing, I explode. Here are the fragments put together by another me. In other words, here is the analysis put together, the reflection assembled by the person who has already experienced this process, who is now a very different person as a result, again, who has nothing in common with the person who had not passed through this process. So Fanon's going to step back and then begin to walk us through this process, the objectification, the explosion, and how he then picks up and reassembles the pieces, or begins to afterward. Now, we mentioned last week that one of Fanon's key influences was Hegel, and specifically the reading of Hegel's master-slave dialectic, which was popularized by the French philosopher Alexander Koyev. Two very basic points are important here. First, that Hegelian dialectics resonated powerfully with many Black and anti-colonial revolutionaries because it offered a vision of the role of dynamic struggle in the development of human self-consciousness. Fanon's teacher, Aimé Césaire, has this letter where he's sort of beginning to read Hegel's Phenomenology, and he's just so struck by it, and he says, look, this is what we needed. This is what we were waiting for, because struggle is at the very heart of it. Second, the master-slave dialectic, which I'll talk about in a second, was crucial in particular because it was seen as a sort of crystallization of this dynamic around the question of slavery, and with an important punchline that will become crucial for the development of Fanon's own dialectical approach. Here's roughly how the argument goes. This is going to be a little philosophically deep. Bear with me. It's actually very, very simple when you get through it. So the goal is to get into it and make it accessible. This is in Hegel's Phenomenology. Two individuals, abstract individuals, confront each other, but in an abstract, sort of ahistorical, quasi-prehistoric encounter. Picture people who have never been with people before. They're wandering through the forest. They come together. They see each other in the forest, right? This is a very familiar kind of story in Western philosophy. This is the way that Hegel is telling it. They're drawn toward one another. And this is very important. But they're not drawn toward each other for simple reasons, right? It's important because there are a whole bunch of Western philosophical traditions that say humans are not drawn toward each other. They don't want to be in community or connection with each other. So this is a social understanding, right? These two individuals are drawn toward one another, but for complex reasons. Picture it in the first person. The sudden and unexpected appearance of the other, looking at you, seeing you, threatens your own self-confidence of your existence in the world, questions you, interrogates you. You want to reestablish self-certainty, and you can't just walk away from that situation, right? You've literally just seen another human being for the first fucking time ever. You got to do something about that. You have to figure out what's going on. You can't walk away, so you need to confront the other, gain their recognition, and therefore reassert yourself in the process. In other words, this leads toward a struggle for Hegel. You're drawn toward the other person, but you're drawn in a struggle. This struggle ensues. One side is victorious, and the other side is defeated. Through this life and death struggle and this coming face to face with one's own mortality, self-consciousness has already begun to spiral forth. We struggle, we begin to understand the reality of the world, we begin to understand ourselves better. We, inessential questions fall away, true and important questions come to the fore. When the struggle ends, the victor becomes the master and the vanquished becomes the slave, according to Hegel. Now, the master seems to be independent and free, and the slave seems to be dependent and under the control of the other. But here's where things get even more interesting in Hegel's account, because the slave begins to work, begins to engage with the world, begins to work the world with their hands and through their labor, gets to know the world. The master, however, does not, right? Living off the other, he becomes lazy and decadent and loses contact with reality. This is all a vast metaphor for human self-consciousness, but the description is actually very true if you look at actually what happens to slave-owning cultures, slave-owning societies, right? They become decadent. The feudal decadence of slave owners, I think, is well known. What's interesting here is that gradually over time, it becomes clear that the master is the one who's actually dependent upon the slave, and the slave is actually more independent, more self-conscious than the decadent master. This inversion is a powerful and important one. It flips upside down our understanding of how sort of consciousness had developed in this situation. Now, Hegel doesn't follow this all the way to its conclusion, but Koyev and then certainly Césaire and Fanon and many others interpret this dynamic as pointing squarely toward slave insurrection, slave rebellion, toward the abolition of that slave relationship through a repetition of this struggle, which continues to develop the process of self-consciousness, in which the oppressed gain self-consciousness through liberation as a sort of spiraling struggle. gaining self-consciousness, gaining self-confidence by fighting back against their oppressors. This is going to be incredibly important when we look at Fanon's approach to violence in The Wretched of the Earth in particular, right? This is the foundation in some ways for what he's talking about. Okay, that's a lot. Already though, we can see some very important resonances. We can see the fact that Fanon's orientation in this chapter is toward the other, is generously reaching out, more generous in fact than Hegel, seeking openness and recognition, but also encountering something that's both like and unlike what Hegel is describing. It's going to be a struggle for sure, but it's going to be a struggle with different barriers to overcome and a more complicated and daunting process for doing so in Fanon's account. And we see right away why this matters for his analysis. Still on the first page, this is right at the bottom of the first page of the chapter. Fanon writes, "As long as the black man remains in his home territory, except for petty internal quarrels, he will not have to experience his being for others. There is, in fact, a being for other as described by Hegel, but any ontology is made impossible in a colonized and acculturated society." Any ontology is impossible. Okay, so first, clearly this isn't the individual conflict of Hegel's account. We're talking about a collective struggle, a collective conflict. Second, we've seen the petty quarrels of what he refers to as the Antillean society as a competitive society, a society of comparaison, of attempting to better your others by proving, your superiority, and that competition is underpinned by competition around being closer to whiteness, right? Struggling with each other, with the central reference point being whiteness or France as the sort of metropolitan society. Third, what does Fanon mean when he says he won't have to experience his being for others if he's in his home territory, if he's in Martinique? He means exactly what he himself learned, that these petty quarrels concealed a more fundamental confrontation to which he was, in his words, oblivious, that he only truly experienced when he landed in France. And the realization was that no matter what kind of self-delusions he had charted out, for example, in the previous chapters, no matter what kind of imaginative escapes were being propagated in Martinique and France, he was simply black, right? Black like others who were racialized in the same way, period. And this is what brings him right back to Hegel. Any ontology is made impossible in a colonized society. If you haven't seen the word before, ontology will be crucial for Fanon. And what it basically means is being, or how we understand and analyze being. So when you hear ontology, think being, right? This was crucial for many existentialists, long sort of, if you look at the titles of existentialist books from Heidegger to Sartre, being is right there in the title. The question is, how do we understand the world, analyze it as an ontological structure? What is the structure of being, and how is that structure constituted? When Fanon says any ontology is made impossible in a colonized society, the first thing he's saying is any singular foundation for what being means in our world. There is no one form of being. And as Fanon says, other writers have missed this fact. I promise if this is confusing, it will start to make sense very soon. Just remember, ontology is being. Okay, what does he do with this concept of ontology? Still on the first page. How are we still on the fucking first page? Well, here we are. The bottom of the first page. In the Weltanschauung, that just means worldview, don't worry about that. In the Weltanschauung of a colonized people, there is an impurity or a flaw that prohibits any ontological explanation. Continue a little further down. Ontology does not allow us to understand the being of the black man since it ignores the lived experience. For not only must the black man be black, he must be black in relation to the white man. The black man has no ontological resistance in the eyes of the white man. No ontological resistance, right? That's the crucial piece. There is a flaw, an ontological flaw, that prevents resistance in the eyes of the white person. So we have a failure of ontology because an ontological flaw located in black people prevents them from having ontological resistance. What does this mean? That there is first no single kind of being in the world. That secondly, black and in some ways other colonized people are excluded from being entirely, condemned, as we've seen in Fanon's introduction, to a zone of non-being, and that as a result, their lived experience, and this is the third piece, simply doesn't register. They don't register as full human beings in the eyes of white people. When they first confront what Fanon calls the white gaze, this is toward the bottom of page 90, they're not seen in the way that other subjects are. He writes, "An unusual weight descended upon us. The real world robbed us of our share." Whereas Jean-Paul Sartre had spoken of the gaze of the other, right? Just the gaze of the other. Abstractly understood, there is one kind of gaze of the other. It has this effect on you. You experience it in a certain way in the world. What Fanon is reminding us is that the white gaze is a more specific thing entirely, right? There is no singular ontology. There's a certain kind of ontological structure and flaw that applies to people of color and black people in particular. There's no single gaze. There's a white gaze that does that work of objectification that Fanon is experiencing on the train, right? Whereas phenomenology analyzes our experience of objects in the world through the interface of what he calls our bodily schema, he suddenly finds his own body's existence in the world collapsing. If you look at the bottom of this page, it's very interesting. This is page 90. This is a sort of a classic kind of phenomenological analysis. He's sitting in his office, right? I know that if I want to smoke, I shall have to stretch out my right arm and grab the pack of cigarettes lying at the other end of the table. As for the matches, they're in the left drawer, and I shall have to move back a little. And I make all these moves not out of habit, but by implicit knowledge, a slow construction of myself as a body in a spatial and temporal world. Such seems to be the schema. The bodily schema that one would normally develop in relation to the world, what he calls a genuine dialectic between my body and the world. But his own experience of his body in the world is very different, right? What he's experiencing, in the face of these sort of racial, slurs that are being thrown at him, is what he calls a kind of certain uncertainty, a pure negation. He says, I exist in the third person. He's having kind of a out-of-body experience that he's already ascribed to us as a kind of objectification. The world is out there. The gaze, the white gaze in particular, is objectifying him, turning him into an object among other objects, robbing him of his relationship with others as a subject, right? Being a subject means something you can interface with, interact with, that's worthy of recognition, but he's an object, breaking up the sort of genuine dialectic between his body and the world. His attempts to sustain this bodily schema collapse, and what does he find instead? He finds first what he calls a historical racial schema. A schema that's constructed by the other, by the white man who had woven me out of 1,000 details, anecdotes, and stories. And underlying this historical racial schema is what he goes on to call an epidermal schema, right? A skin-based identification schema predetermined and visible from the outside according to skin color. In case you've lost track, we're still where the chapter began with the racial slurs that he's subjected to, but it's not just any time or any place. He's on a train in Lyon, in the southeast of France, where he's studying psychiatry. And the racial objectification in this case is being carried out by a child. Remember the last chapter where he says, even a drunk can come up on the streets of Paris and talk down to you as if you're inferior, right? Even a child in this case, or in some senses, especially a white child, can do the devastating work of race. And meanwhile, you're right, if you flip it, it's so perverse because he's the one who would be spoken to as if he were a child, but here's the child doing the actual sort of racial overdetermination in this process. Look at the bottom of page 91. The child is scared. Now they were beginning to be scared of me. I wanted to kill myself laughing, but laughter had become out of the question. over to the top of 92. I couldn't take it any longer. In the train, it was a question of being aware of my body, no longer in the third person, but in triple. In the train, instead of one seat, they left me two or three. I was no longer enjoying myself. I was unable to discover the feverish coordinates of the world. I existed in triple. I approached the other, and the other, evasive, hostile, but not opaque, transparent, and absent, vanished. Nausea. Nausea is a Sartrean category, right? Sartre has a very famous play on existential nausea. Now, we mentioned last week that Fanon exists in this sort of long tradition of the fragmentation of self, right? Identified by third world revolutionary thinkers, right? Double consciousness, Gloria Anzaldúa in the sort of Chicana feminist tradition, identifying the ways that Western philosophy is built on this conception of a sort of unitary psychic structure, and yet the lived reality of colonized and racialized people is that that structure is split, divided, fragmented. And Fanon is speaking about this splintering into three, at the very least, right? He finds his being, his self-understanding fractured, splintered, not just double consciousness, but triple. Further down on the same page, disoriented, incapable of confronting the other, the white man. I transported myself on that particular day very far from myself. I gave myself up as an object, peeling, stripping my skin, causing a hemorrhage that left congealed black blood all over my body. And again, the orientation, I quite simply wanted to be a man among other men. I would have liked to enter the world, our world, young and sleek, a world we could build together. And yet, he finds this attempt, this openness, this sort of very generous relationship to the world, amputated in his work, and amputated over and over again. He's surrounded, he's trapped, he's encircled. There's no escape, as he later puts it at the end of the chapter. In order to break the vicious cycle, he explodes. And this is him still on the train on page 94. The white man is all around me. Up above, the sky is tearing at its navel. The earth crunches under my feet and sings white, white. All this whiteness burns me to a cinder. The circle is tightening on him, right? He's so fully objectified, he has no way out. So what does he do? He explodes, right? We've reached the explosion. He says very clearly, "Fuck you, madame," to the child's mother. Now, that's the explosion. One of many that we'll document and talk about. But the question here, I'll say, and we'll take some questions right here in a minute. So if folks in the chat want to get those ready, if folks in the room want to begin thinking about questions you want answered, it's important to understand that the question here and the question always is what happens after the explosion, right? After the eruption, what does it set into motion? What does it make possible? How does it reorganize the landscape of the struggle? And how does it reset the possibility of mutual recognition, or better yet, something different, something beyond mutual recognition? So we've reached the point where Fanon, so objectified by this child's gaze, by the sort of racial overdetermination, by the tightening circle, explodes and blows it up. What kind of questions do folks have? This is just some beautiful writing, right? There's actually no way to imagine writing this well. One second.
Let me give you the microphone. Because there's a stream.
Okay. So, well, like, through the whole process, like, he's talking about this circle that's being drawn, and, like, I just didn't really understand, like, what the circle kind of represented. Because he mentions it multiple times,
Yeah.
like, throughout this section.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
What is the circle? Like, what constitutes the circle, right? It's, first and foremost, it's constituted by the fact that he feels surrounded by this sort of group of white people on the train. They're staring at him, there's racial slurs on the one hand, there's false compliments on the other, there's overall this idea that the gaze is sort of entrapping him, that no matter what he does, he's caught within it. He's an object, he's not a subject in the world. It's not a question of engaging with him or seeing him as worthy of engaging with, right? This is the ontological flaw that he talks about, right? He doesn't truly exist as a person to be engaged with. In other words, for Hegel, the struggle is for recognition, right? You see this other person, you want to fight so that they will recognize you. What Fanon's going to say, and he'll explain it even more clearly next week, is that that's not what, white society wants, right? It's not looking for recognition from a subject, right? What we call an intersubjective relationship. It's looking at an object, right? And if you're trapped and encircled as an object, one of the questions that Fanon's going to be answering is, how do you get out of that? He's going to try and test out a whole bunch of possible kind of escape routes in this chapter, but they're all going to fail, right? And the only way out for him is going to be to explode the circle at the beginning. But that's only going to be a beginning. When you explode the circle, the question is, what then does that begin to make possible? Yeah, that's a great question.
Questions from the chat. The first one is gaze defined by the person looking or being looked at? What about intersectionality, such as misogynoir? And then the second question is, how does the framework of the gaze or Hegelian dialectic limit the actual experience of Black people? I think Toni Morrison writes outside of the gaze. What could you say about this?
Great question. Is that both questions or that's two? They're completely related, and we're getting ahead. We're getting toward the questions that are posed by this framework. Right? Like, on the one hand, I think the first question raises a question of the limits of almost like an existential frame, and the second one, the limits of the Hegelian dialectical frame. Again, don't get too worried about the terminology. They're actually very much related to each other, right? The question is, as we mentioned about Jean-Paul Sartre, who writes a lot about the gaze, right? The existential experience of being subjected to the gaze of the other, meaning any other, right? The problem with that framework is the idea that all gazes are the same, right? That you walk out of your house, it doesn't matter who's looking at you. Why? Because we're very familiar with this, like the sort of racial neutrality in philosophy, right? The assumption that all experiences are universal, that the gaze is just one kind of gaze. Fanon's saying there's a specific gaze, it is a white gaze when gazing upon sort of a person of color is an objectifying gaze, right? It's a gaze that locks you in. In that sense, to answer the question just super clearly, it's not so much about the person experiencing it, right? The gaze is structured by a world, right? Again, this is what existentialism kind of misses in its more abstract or voluntaristic manifestations, which is that, we don't get to determine the structure of that gaze, right? Fanon, a Black man in Lyon, walks out of his house, gets on a train, that gaze is all around him. It's predetermined by the colonial and racial structure of the society, right? How it's experienced is a different question, the different manifestations of how it can be produced, reproduced within communities, and according to different parameters, I think is a really crucial one. How does the framework of of Hegel's understanding limit how we approach this question? In almost exactly the same way, but kind of transposed onto the ontological question, right? The lack of being, the lack of resistance means that what is going to be understood as a kind of dialectic of recognition, of struggle for the recognition of the other, simply doesn't operate, right? For Fanon, he said, listen, if Hegel assumes we all confront each other evenly on a sort of reciprocal and sort of reversible plane of being and existence, an ontological plane, right? Meaning those two individuals look at each other, it doesn't matter who's who, they could be reversed, they could be whatever. That's not real historical reality. Real historical reality contains all of the weight of that sort of racial and colonial structure, right? It matters who's looking, it matters how, and if one person is looking at the other and not seeing them as a person, there is no struggle for recognition, right? There's no basis for a struggle for recognition. That basis is blocked, and that's why an explosion is necessary. These are not abstract questions, right? Why first and foremost, why is it the case that the single most important driving force of American history is Black rebellion? And why does Black struggle manifest as rebellion, right? Because it can't manifest in other ways, right? The very famous phrase, "the riot is the voice of the unheard," is a diagnosis of this phenomenon, right? If speaking, asking, arguing, analyzing, rationalizing doesn't work, then explosion is the only alternative, right? This is the sort of structure that Fanon is trying to identify. Cool.
Question, which was like, so we're talking about how, like Fanon views, like, so he's talking about how he's being viewed as an object, and like how that's the flaw with this idea that like everyone has the same gaze. Does he ever speak on like what can be done to break out of that kind of a non-being zone, and if so, like how that could be done?
Yeah, that is such a good question, man. These questions are killing me. I mean, I hope everyone appreciates how good these questions are. This is crazy. So, this is going to be what we're going to be talking about. What I will say, I think, to foreground, the question is what can be done to break out of what you recall from the introduction is the zone of non-being, right? Again, picture the zone of non-being. How does he describe it? He describes it as a subterranean zone, a veritable hell. This is a literal, almost like a sort of, a depth, analysis of what he's talking about. Ontological, ontology is the smoothness of the surface. It is what Hegel calls the Grund, or the ground. Two people confront each other on that smooth surface in the struggle for recognition, but what happens when that surface falls away and when one person is underground? When one person is trapped, condemned to a zone of non-being, which is a subterranean zone. There's no basis for struggle, right? Again, this is why there has to be some struggle prior to the struggle, which is what we'll get to right now, which is going to, be, exactly how Fanon begins to sort of unfold it. So, what happens after the explosion? What is the another me who puts the already fragmented fragments back together tell us? How does he, Fanon, the other, another me, how does he understand the before and the after? Let's follow his own description. We're literally talking about, he's on a train, there's a sort of explosive reaction that he's had, and the question is, what then happens, right? So this is on page 94. Let's follow it very closely. What's the first thing he says? The battlefield, the first thing he says is, the mother of the child, her face colored with shame. At last, I was freed from my rumination. I realized two things at once. I had identified the enemy and created a scandal. Overjoyed, we could now have some fun. Something has already happened, right? I was freed from my rumination. And notice, this is a very, very dialectical way to understand it, right? Notice immediately the effect is two-sided. Things are happening on both sides of this conflict. Dialectics, struggle, conflict. It's happening, it's breaking out. What's happening on both sides? On the one hand, he says, I realized two things at once. I had identified an enemy and I had created a scandal. Overjoyed, we could now have some fun. This wasn't an isolated explosion. It was a very public explosion in which an objectified object exploded in plain sight, only to suddenly appear as something like or something approaching a human subject. What does he say next? The battlefield had been drawn up. I could enter the lists. This is a very interesting way to phrase it, and the structure is important. The battle is not won. The battle hasn't even begun, right? The battlefield had been drawn up. Fanon is overjoyed at the very possibility of anything resembling a battle at all, because a direct fight hadn't even seemed possible a moment earlier, right? A battle is something that's engaged between two relative equals, in which there's at the very least a recognition that the other is a threat to you, a threat worthy of struggle. What happens when you can't even fight your enemy? What happens when you can't even engage with them in that way? So Fanon is seeing the beginning of the possibility of a battle. And here the very fact starts to transform the person who is engaging in resistance in that process. Now here's a very interesting sidebar. Frederick Douglass, who, without ever having read Hegel, as far as I can tell, described something very, very similar when he spoke of his own encounter with a slave breaker, Edward Covey, who was sent to break his spirit, right? They fought, they engaged in a physical conflict. He didn't even necessarily win, but he evaded Covey, he fought him back, he threw him down, he avoided him. Douglass describes this encounter, the aftermath of this encounter, I should put it, in very striking terms. He says, I was still a slave in form, but I was free in fact, right? He wasn't actually free. He still had to struggle for his freedom. He still had to escape, which he would do. But the point is, what is happening when he engages in struggle against this slave breaker? He begins to develop, as he understands it, the self-confidence of a human being. And he determines and limits the ability of that slave breaker to impact him, right? He describes it in almost exactly the same kind of dialectical way. Now, Fanon had approached the world with generosity, as he puts it on the bottom of 94. I was prepared to forget, to forgive, and to love. My message was flung back at me like a slap in the face. The white world had prevented me from participating. It demanded that a man behave like a man. It demanded of me that I behave like a black man. I hailed the world. Hailing, this is a sort of very phenomenological concept. I hailed the world. I reached out toward the world, engaged with the world, and the world amputated my enthusiasm. Amputated my enthusiasm. Enthusiasm here is enthusiasm. It's almost the same word in French. But it's also very closely connected for Fanon to a category which will come up again in this chapter, and which he's already sort of distanced himself from in the introduction, which is what's often translated as zeal, right, or zealousness. He said, I'm wary of zealousness. I don't trust it. I don't trust that sort of feeling. In the history of ideas, enthusiasm in this sense is related to the concept of fanaticism, right? It's understood as what Alberto Toscano calls fanaticism's noble cousin, right? Enthusiasm is a kind of mode of becoming overcome with and engaged in the struggle in a zealous kind of way. We'll come back to that, that idea, because it's going to become very important toward the end of this chapter. I'll show them. They can't say I didn't warn them. Slavery, no longer a subject of discussion, just a bad memory. My so-called inferiority that we talked about last week, a hoax that it would be better to laugh about. I was prepared to forget everything provided the world integrated me. My incisors were ready to go into action. I could feel them, sharp. And he was rejected again. And then to the top of page 95. I made up my mind, since it was impossible to rid myself of an innate complex, to assert myself as a black man. Since the other was reluctant to recognize me, there was only one answer: to make myself known. To make myself known. That's the summary of the explosion, right? That's Fanon's understanding on a conceptual level of what's happening when he explodes. And if you want to find the very heart of Fanon's dialectic in this book and the turning point in his own subjective process, it is this question, the dividing line between what he describes as the black person fleeing from their race and the person embracing it. To make myself known, to stand up, to struggle, to engage, and to set into motion everything that comes afterwards. So we have to pay close attention to how this kind of plays out. Once we do, however, we see that this question of identifying with their race is still an open one, and that we mean specifically the question of what kind of identification is this going to be. I'll say one thing, and then I think there are more questions accumulating that we can take. We don't usually break it up as much, but I like the sort of pace of the way the questions are emerging. The one thing I'll say before these questions is that this is where Fanon precisely returns to the question of anti-Semitism, which he had raised before. And he distinguishes and plays out both what he had understood to be the similarities, the fundamental similarities between anti-Semitism and and anti-blackness, and the important differences that he wants to identify. He quotes Anti-Semite and Jew by Sartre, one of Fanon's most important influences in this period. It's an incredible analysis of anti-Semitism and the logic of the anti-Semite. Here, what's key is that Sartre speaks of Jewish people as being, in his words, overdetermined from the inside, cautious, not wanting to appear too publicly as Jewish in an anti-Semitic society, self-policing, policing their own appearances, right? Fanon takes this as a starting point to mark the distinction. He says his acts and behavior are the determining factor. This is very, very different from anti-blackness, right? We've already seen, and you probably can guess how, right? He describes it as a sort of, in reaction to Sartre's framing by saying, in an anti-black society, a black person is overdetermined from the outside, right? This is not an escapable fate. It's an sort of epidermally imposed identification. It's imposed on him on the train collectively before he even opens his mouth, before he even acts in any kind of way. This does not, prevent Fanon from identifying with sort of the struggle against anti-Semitism. And again, this is where I mentioned it last time, his reference to his great teacher, Césaire. I believe this is a reference to Césaire when he says, he says that, this is on page 101. My philosophy teacher from the Antilles, who reminded me one day, when you hear someone insulting the Jews, pay attention, he's talking about you, right? Fanon says, at first I thought this was about my own subjective orientation, right? This kind of generosity, this attack on the human, where it's like if any attack on the human is an attack on all of the human, right? He says that's actually an overcomplicated view, and maybe his own internalization of it. He says, since then I've understood that what he meant quite simply was that the anti-Semite is inevitably a negrophobe, right? Anti-blackness and anti-Semitism go hand in hand, and the structures are the same, right? We've seen the structure of language where you can never, if you're black, you can never speak proper French no matter how perfectly you speak it, right? This is the structure that Sartre had identified when it came to anti-Semitism. So here he's marking that really important distinction and also maintaining a kind of relationship, to the struggle against anti-Semitism. Black people, unlike most Jewish people in his account, constitute what he calls phobic objects, right? They appear in the world, in a way that provokes anxiety. He points out and analyzes the way that, something that, again, we know, I think, very well, the way that racialized people can be both invisible on the one hand and hypervisible at the same time, right? Invisible as a subject for engagement and recognition, but registering as object of anxiety and, if not, as an open threat. Cool. Do we want to take a couple questions?
Okay, I'm going to try and go slowly to ask this question. There's a lot of parts going on. Okay.
Not too many parts, Joe. Come on.
So, okay, insofar as ontology follows a dialectical progression, right? There are essential moments in the unfolding of being, and the master-slave dialectic diagrams moment by moment, a moment of losing self-certainty, a moment of assertion, a moment of struggle, a moment of vanquishing, another moment of recognition, right? These are kind of essential moments that characterize what we mean when we use the term dialectic together. Given that's the case, and we pointed out, and you pointed out too, the way Fanon describes his own book, Black Skin, White Masks, as I think it's on 161, he calls it a progressive infrastructure, a path to disalienation, a mirror, where he's kind of going through moments as almost positions or attitudes that maybe he's not at the end of the day subscribing to, but he's kind of testing them and then showing the way that they fall apart. I'm wondering to the extent that this moment where Fanon says, "Fuck you, lady, white lady," I wonder to the extent to which that is analogous, is you can make an analogy between that moment and a dialectical moment. And I say that because whereas on the top of 95, he says, there's only one answer to make myself known, right? As you just noted, immediately after that, then, he brings up the Jew again. And he says, oh, wait, I want to make myself known. Wait, I got to remember I'm different than the Jew. I'm overdetermined from without. And on the very next page, 96, in the top paragraph, he says, all I want is to be an anonymous. So immediately after he has this feeling, I want to make myself known, then he says, I just want to be anonymous. So I kind of take that duality together as the moment. Whereas rather than assertion of himself as an identity that he knows, which would all be very dialectical things, actually there's this internal division, a kind of vertigo that he's experiencing, where he still lacks that kind of self-certainty and doesn't know himself. And I think that kind of accords with, especially in the next chapter, in chapter 6, where he's going through psychoanalysis, and he's constantly said, we have to move slowly, we have to be careful, and he's kind of showing you that there's a progression where all these ideas that require some kind of certainty or identity, they all kind of fall apart. I can't assert anything here. At the end of the day, the black can still lacks any kind of historical coordinates to congeal into an identity. That being said, I wonder at what point using the term dialectical to describe what Fanon is doing is not enough. To me, it doesn't seem like enough. It seems like Fanon's doing something in excess of dialectics. We're calling it dialectical again, and then on page 114, he says, a dialectic that introduces necessity expels me from myself. He has that whole argument with Sartre, where he's like, you're taking away all of my agency with this dialectical universality, particularity, universality. So I just wonder to what extent calling Fanonism dialectical is a kind of maybe conceptual domestication, or it puts him on a track where I don't see him in Blacks and White Mask asserting anything. It's this moment of vertigo where his nothingness is all he's left with.
No, that's a great question. I really appreciate it. And it's something we're going to unfold, but I'll say, I'll definitely say a few things about it. Do we want to take another one real quick?
I had a question, which is, he said when he was talking about the differences between black people and Jewish people, he says the Jewish man is white. And this is interesting to me because in this statement, he kind of completely pushes out non-white Jews. And I was just wondering if he is saying this just for the sake of this thought experiment, let's take a white Jewish person versus a black person, or if he just wasn't in his mind at all when he was writing it.
That's a great question as well. Thank you both. I'll answer the second one first because I think it's it's important. So first and foremost, there's two pieces I would say. One is that he's speaking of European Jews in Europe in an anti-Semitic context, right? In France. So he's talking about, and he's speaking about Jewish people as largely, people that could pass for white if they chose to, right? So that's essentially, in a practical sense, that's all he's saying, right? Because he's saying, I cannot pass. I am condemned to be observed as I approach all of these things. And so that's the sort of concrete piece. What's interesting about it is that he says, and he's using white there as a very epidermalized understanding, right? In terms of skin, right? Because what is, you know, the gray area there, and this is a gray area that his teacher Césaire also is careful about, you know, paying attention to, is that of course anti-Semitism is a process of excluding Jewish people from being, right, and from, you know, and from being white in particular. So it's important to understand that as a dynamic and as a process, but from a practical standpoint, what he's talking about is assimilation, the ability to pass, and a centering of, and this is what he gets from Sartre, right, a centering of behavior, visible religiousness, visible Jewishness as the key questions. This question about, which ultimately turned out to be a question about dialectics, I think is super important. As I mentioned in the, you know, in the last session, there's a lot of debate around whether we should understand Fanon as dialectical, and I'll say just right from the jump, I only understand Fanon as dialectical insofar as we're expanding and stretching what we understand as dialectics kind of to the breaking point. So that's just to be really, really clear about it. And what that means is, yes, and this gets to this question of the degrees to which the Hegelian understanding limits, you know, Fanon. Yes. Why? Because he is approaching this other person in the world and finding that it's not this sort of mutual struggle for recognition, right? The terrain and the ground literally doesn't exist for that struggle, right? So the process that is unfolding, and specifically the sort of the fuck you, whether or not the fuck you is a dialectical moment, is something that I understand to be a sort of pre-dialectical setting of the terms, right? The kind of thing that he finds necessary to, you know, as I put it, jumpstart any kind of possible dialectic. The key point here is that it's radically different, the result, right? It's not just, you know, okay, we have now reasserted our reciprocity, we can engage in a process of struggle for recognition. That's not how it works. When the dialectic begins in non-existence and non-being, the process is far more radical. And here there's a really interesting parallel that I, you know, sort of draw with the way that the Latin American philosopher of liberation, Enrique Dussel, speaks of dialectics. Because he does this similar thing where he's sort of pushing back on, they're very similar influences. He's pushing back on dialectics as domesticating precisely, right? As a sort of colonial expansion of the same. Ontology, he says, this singular understanding of being is very colonial. Dialectics runs the risk of being colonial insofar as it doesn't, the sort of moving of the two parts is just a reproduction or a very small minor alteration of the existing world, right? Two mutually recognized parts engaging in a kind of struggle. He refers to the alternative, which he identifies as ana-dialectical, drawing upon the sort of analectical understanding of what happens when you begin from outside of that system, right? You begin from what's excluded. In his case, he's talking about indigenous sort of, you know, alternative sort of communal structures that are excluded from Latin American society. What happens when the sort of starting point for dialectical struggle begins from those places, right? Begins from exteriority, begins from the outside, and in the case of Fanon, begins from subalterity, right? The underground of this sort of non-existence. I think that's a far more radical process, right? The ingredients are more radical, the process is more radical, it's a more explosive beginning and a more indeterminate ending. That's the sort of punchline that I would give to that piece. Fanon is defending himself. He's standing up, and this gets to sort of the beginning of your question, but we're gonna sort of move through it, I think, a little more slowly. Fanon has arrived at that moment of explosion that he describes as making himself known. It involves asserting himself as Black. He says, listen, like you all are telling me that's what I have to be, so I'm going to embrace that, right? I'm gonna take that up as a sort of banner and as a sort of shield. I will make and embrace that identity and I will defend it. And Fanon sets about defending, you know, notice that he's already had to retreat, he's been amputated, he's been pushed back multiple times. That's going to continue to happen, right? Remember, the first few chapters of the book are processes of trying to escape and getting, you know, sort of cut off, right? The escape fails, it's a sort of blind alley, that's going to continue happening. To defend himself, Fanon first turns to rationality, and Fanon is a very rational person, right? He's a doctor, he's scientific, he wants to understand the world and confront the world as a rational, as a rational phenomenon. Here he says, I felt, this is on page 99, I felt the knife blades of reason sharpening within me. I made up the mind to defend myself. He turns to science, he turns to genetics, he says there's no basis for this racial hierarchy. It doesn't make sense. There's no scientific basis, there is no historical basis, none of that makes any sense. He tries to As he puts it, I reintegrated the brotherhood of man through science, through rationality, but I was soon disillusioned. He tries to rationalize, to explain, to bring historical evidence to the argument. There was no arguing, no reasoning with a white supremacist world, and again, he finds himself caught in the same kind of catch-22. As he puts it at the top of page 106, I had to choose. What am I saying? I had no choice, right? I had no choice. And here you've got, I think, this funny thing. Sartre has these two plays, right? Nausea and Huis clos, which we often translate as no exit, right? And he's sort of going back and forth between the sort of nausea and the lack of exit or the closed door that Sartre is describing. Reason isn't working. Since reason doesn't work, Fanon throws himself into unreason, and specifically into what he understands as the unreason of Black identity. Again, he does not believe race is a thing, right? He's pushed to this point where he throws himself into it. He dives headlong into Blackness, into Black history, into Black culture, Black superiority, as he puts it on page I think it's 107. Where is the piece? Where he says, irrational up to my neck, right? He had been thrown into unreason. He had to embrace that unreason. Oh yeah, on page 102. I'd rationalized the world, and the world had rejected me in the name of color prejudice. Since there was no way we could agree on the basis of reason, I resorted to irrationality. It was up to the white man to be more irrational than I. Here I am at home. I am made of the irrational. I wade in the irrational, irrational up to my neck, and now let my voice ring out. And you have all of these incredible extracts from poetry, right? Negritude poetry. Some, very confusingly, there's a combination. Some from Aimé Césaire, who we've said is a more sort of politicized, dialectical understanding of negritude. Some from Senghor, who has a more essentialist, sort of eternal understanding. Here already you see in the Césaire the sort of political nature. He says, my negritude is not a stone, its deafness hurled against the clamor of day. Sartre in Anti-Semite and Jew has said an anti-Semite is a stone, right? Like impermeable, irrational. You know, there's no sort of basis for their understanding and no getting through it. And, you know, Césaire is saying something similar in the negative, right? My negritude is not an opaque spot of dead water over the dead eye of the earth. My negritude is neither a tower nor a cathedral. It reaches deep down into the red flesh of the soil. He's turning to poetry. He's turning to what he, is calling here irrationality. He's embracing the irrationality that the world has forced upon him in his understanding. He's embraced the rhythm of it, the poetry of it. Here I am, or so here I was is on 108. Here I was, the poet of the world. The white man had discovered poetry that had nothing poetic about it. Fair. The soul of the white man was corrupted. Fair. At last I had been recognized. I was no longer a non-entity. Next paragraph, I was soon to become disillusioned, right? He had thrown himself into the irrationality of sort of the sort of rhythm and poetry of his blackness, and yet he finds that that too is not a path, right? My originality had been snatched from me. Why? Because along comes white society and says, isn't it so great that you all are sort of, you feel and you have rhythm and you have music? That reunites us with ourselves. That completes us. He found himself reincorporated once again. This was no escape either. Turning to ancient African civilization and excavating Black antiquity to prove the white man wrong, but they incorporate that into the prehistory of their own world. As he writes on page 111, this is the white man talking, you reconcile us with ourselves. And then he adds, so they were countering my irrationality with rationality, my rationality with the true rationality. I couldn't hope to win. I tested my heredity. I did a complete checkup of my sickness. I wanted to be typically Black. That was out of the question. I wanted to be white. That was a joke. And when I tried to claim my negritude intellectually as a concept, they snatched that away from me. They proved to me that my reasoning was nothing but a phase in the dialectic. The game is rigged from the start. He can't win, right? And here he turns to one of his most important allies, one of his most important comrades. He turns to Jean-Paul Sartre again, an ally of Black and anti-colonial struggles, a revolutionary philosopher and a communist. And here's something really, really important about understanding Fanon. It's a sort of personality trait, and it's also a philosophical approach, which is that Fanon is incredibly severe with his allies, right? And there's a reason for this. It has crucial consequences for his thought. He's severe with his allies because he feels their betrayals even more powerfully, more sharply, but also because critiquing allies gets us closer to understanding the world, right? We can critique our enemies all day long and we're not making any headway. But when you're critiquing your allies, and when he critiques Sartre in this case, it provides what I see as really the best crystallization of his own dialectical vision. We get a lot of precision out of it, so we really need to nail down what sets them apart from one another. And I've mentioned already the fact that a lot of people see Sartre and Fanon as having essentially the same understanding of this kind of dialectic of race in relation to class, the overcoming of race. So we really have to nail down what is different, because there are crucial differences. What did Sartre get wrong? Back on page 111, this is a quote from Sartre where he's introducing, again, he had said, "They proved to me my reasoning was nothing but a phase in the dialectic." The quote is from Sartre, who's introducing a really important volume of negritude poetry, right? And he's introducing it with an essay called Black Orpheus. Why Orpheus? Because Orpheus was a Greek poet, if you know the story, but also the story ends in a tragic way. He's trying to save his wife who's dying. He goes down to Hades. He sort of tries to trick and woo Hades with poetry, and ultimately it fails in the end, right? So we're talking about the tragic limitations of poetry to deal with the devil. Fair enough. Sartre writes, and this is the sort of block quote, "The Negro, as we've said, creates an anti-racist racism. He does not at all wish to dominate the world." It's more over on the other side that he gets concerned. "Nevertheless, the notion of race does not intersect with the notion of class. The one is concrete in particular, the other is universal and abstract. In fact," this is further down, "negritude appears as the weak stage of a dialectical progression. The theoretical and practical affirmation of white supremacy is the thesis. The position of negritude as antithetical value is the moment of negativity, but this negative moment is not sufficient in itself, and the blacks who employ it well know it. They know that it serves to pave the way for the synthesis or the realization of the human society without race. Thus, negritude is dedicated to its own destruction. It is transition and not result, a means and not the ultimate goal." A means and not the ultimate goal. What did Sartre do wrong? Just when Fanon had seized upon his negritude, just when he had said, "You have forced me into this position of having to identify as black," this was taken away from him. He says immediately, "When I read this page, I felt they had robbed me of my last chance." He said, "We've been dealt a fatal blow. We had appealed to a friend of the colored peoples, and this friend had found nothing better to do than to demonstrate the relativity of their action. This born Hegelian had forgotten that consciousness needs to get lost in the night of the absolute." Consciousness needs to get lost in the night of the absolute. What is Sartre saying, first and foremost? He's saying black identity is important, but it's self-transitioning, right? It's not an end in itself. It's not, again, an essential, biological fact. It's not an essential cultural fact. It's a transitional moment of struggle that will give way to what? The class struggle. So we're seeing the way that he's recognizing black struggle and black identity and negritude poetry, but he's folding it into a broader, universal, objective dialectic of class struggle, right? What's happening? Why does Fanon feel robbed? What has Sartre stolen? To be clear, and this is what gets very confusing for some, Fanon does not believe that blackness is real in any kind of biological or genetic sense. He knows that it's simply made up. He knows that it's invented by the white world to condemn the black. But he also knows, as we might say, that while race is a social construct, it's also a political reality. It's very real as he experiences it on the train, through a child, and every day. This isn't where he and Sartre disagree. So what's the problem? First, and this is how most interpretations go, there's the fact that Sartre, quote, this is Fanon writing, Sartre, who remains the other, is a white man, right? He's saying, listen, there's an inevitable condescension that's built in here at the intersection of his identity, his position as the sort of philosopher king, and the way he uses objective philosophical language. This is important, right? Who are you to tell us that blackness as an identity is simply transitioning? It's a step toward the class struggle, right? But the second piece, I think, is much more important for Fanon. That isn't the heart of the betrayal, I don't think. What's important is that he had betrayed the struggle as what Fanon calls a born Hegelian. Like, how did you, a born Hegelian, a dialectical thinker, how did you miss this piece, right? And what does he say immediately after that? This born Hegelian had forgotten that consciousness needs to get lost in the night of the absolute. What the fuck does that mean? It means that identity, black struggle needs to have weight. It needs to have dialectical weight. It needs to push forward the transformation of the world. It needs to be a power and a force, right? But how and why would it be a power and a force if we're saying from the beginning that it's just a step? If we're saying that it's just a transition? Why would anyone fight in the name of and identify powerfully with black struggle if you're already from the beginning being told that you're just, taking one step in an inevitable progression? There's something deeply undialectical about short-circuiting that struggle in that kind of way, right? Consciousness needs to get lost in the night of the absolute, the only condition for attaining self-consciousness. And here again, the category of zeal or enthusiasm is crucial. He said, what had been stolen from them is black zeal, right? Black struggle, the absolute struggle of identifying with and pushing forward that transformation. I needed to lose myself totally in negritude. I needed not to know. The dialectic that introduces necessity as a support for my freedom expels me from myself. It shatters my impulsive position. It has to be a full 100% identification. Otherwise, history simply doesn't move forward. Dialectics requires that struggle, right? He says, and this is his experience of that, he reminded me that my negritude was nothing but a weak stage. Truthfully, I'm telling you, I sensed my shoulders slipping from the world and my feet no longer felt the caress of the ground. Without a black past, without a black future, it was impossible for me to live in my blackness. Not yet white, no longer completely black, I was damned. Jean-Paul Sartre forgets that the black man suffers in his body quite differently from the white man. Here he says, I was damned, right? That's the condemned of the wretched of the earth, right? This is the first emergence of him referring to this kind of condemnation in relation to what would become his most fundamental category. Sartre wasn't actually wrong about black identity, that it was partial, that it was transitional, that it would eventually be transcended in a broader universal struggle. He was wrong about the center of gravity, about how his and our position exists within that process, and about how clearly we and he could see and predict its future unfolding. Now, this may seem like a minor point, but it matters immensely, and it matters in ways that are probably familiar to us. In the ceaseless debates about the relationship between race and class, and about how we can bring the two together in political organizing, we see the parameters and the spectrum of this disagreement. On the one hand, extreme class reductionists, some of whom go further than even Sartre in terms of erasing the importance of black experience and struggle entirely. And on the other hand, those approaches to black struggle that either treat race as biologically real or politically inescapable. And here, we could point towards something like Afro-pessimism's refusal of working in any kind of coalition, right? And the way that these approaches similarly evacuate class from the perspective, from the picture on the kind of other extreme. So we're locating ourselves within a sort of dialectical understanding of race in relation to class, even if this doesn't fully answer the question, it needs more precision. Because the question is one of the role of the Black struggle in the present versus its simple inclusion within broader struggles. And so here we could say that Fanon's center of gravity in Black Skin, White Mask, his understanding of dialectics, of how we understand it, of how we engage with it, is in the present, centered in the present, in the Black struggle, in the zealousness that is required for that struggle to matter, in the zealousness that's required for people to fight for Black revolution, right? In the center of it means that that is the focus, right? We're not trying to predict or think about the sort of ultimate horizon. It's only after the struggle, when that struggle has done its work, that these categories can begin to give way, but we aren't there yet, according to Fanon. It's about how and where he locates himself. So this is less the kind of autonomy of Black struggle in relation to class struggle that we saw last semester with someone like C.L.R. James, right? Or someone like, an organization like the League of Revolutionary Black Workers. These are class struggle frameworks that incorporate and understand the role of specifically Black struggles. That's not what Fanon is engaged with here. It's less the kind of later intercommunalism of the Black Panther Party, and it's more some of the elements of the nationalist vision that are kind of interwoven with it throughout the years. And for me, what Fanon is describing here, the sort of location of the center of gravity of that dialectic, bears the most similarity to the way that Malcolm X understood Black struggle in the brief interlude between leaving the Nation of Islam and being murdered by the Nation of Islam and the FBI, right? In that very brief period, Malcolm X puts forward a very similar understanding, which is that a joint class struggle might be possible, but in many cases we simply aren't there yet. That the precondition to that struggle is actually Black struggle. That struggle is what lays the foundation for the possibility of a future transformation. And of course, Fanon and Malcolm were writing around the same time, which is a time that is in some ways very different from our own, but also in some ways very, very similar. So these are pieces that we want to bear in mind as we begin to sort of locate them and think about how they speak to our moment. And I want to draw your attention before we take some more questions to the way that Fanon ends this chapter, which is with tears, right? Tears at all of the betrayals, tears at all of the attempts at freedom, the possibility of liberation, the paths out that ultimately end up not being paths anywhere at all. Not responsible for my acts, at the crossroads between nothingness and infinity, I began to weep. Right? Nothingness, non-existence, infinity, absolute existence and fullness, trapped between the two at the crossroads, he ends this chapter weeping, right? But even though he's weeping, the parameters of the struggle have been laid out, and we're going to see the way that they move forward. The pre-dialectical struggle that makes possible the possibility of a struggle moving forward is something that we're going to see him clarify next week, because next week we're going to wrap up our sort of discussion of Black Skin, White Mask by talking about chapter 7, which deals with dialectics and recognition, and the conclusion. But we're also going to see how this decolonized, transformed dialectical framework that Fanon is offering will map onto the way he understands the struggle in Algeria in the future. So we're going to take some questions in the last 10 minutes that we have. Because I keep forgetting, however, before we go to the questions, I'm going to mention the fact that I would be irresponsible not to mention the fact that Abolition School is, as you may have seen, running an ongoing fundraiser to allow us to continue to exist. Thanks to the support of our community over the past few months, we were able to launch our full semester, including this, and including our 101 cohort that meets on Tuesdays. And so please, to you all in the room, but also to folks on the stream, consider donating to our fundraiser, sharing it to family members, sharing it to people that have money and would be able to support our work. What kind of questions do folks have in the space, on the stream? It's a dense chapter. We know it's a dense chapter, so happy to work through whatever pieces are unclear.
I'm going to read 2 questions from the stream
Cool.
to finish us out tonight. The first one is rebellion necessary if one was to exist outside of the white gaze, to deny, reject, or negate the colonial order as means of redistribution? Does this then mean outside of double narcissism? That's the first question. And then the second one is, if there is a revolutionary power to one's self-fragmentation or explosion as well as its pain, does Fanon ever comment on what repair might be?
Yeah. They seem really tied together from understanding. Could you read the beginning of the first one again? Is rebellion necessary even though, or?
If one was to exist outside of a white gaze.
Oh, I see. And then, is there a revolutionary function to the explosion connected to the question of repair? Yes, no, absolutely. Is rebellion necessary if one existed outside of the white gaze? I don't know. I guess the first thing I would say is it's a hypothetical, and I don't think Fanon is super concerned with hypotheticals. But on a concrete level, you can think about what that means, right? Fanon in his youth was, relatively speaking, outside of the white gaze, right? He himself did not confront its overbearing, objectifying weight. He lived in Martinique, right? A society that had developed its own, or what seemed as if it was its own racial hierarchy that is very unfamiliar maybe to us in the United States, in which there were black people who were more white and then there were black people who were more black, right? And that was based on class, it was based on skin color, it was based on language. Fanon living and existing in that, in that sort of context was witnessing and experiencing the same exact, what he describes as the lack of a need to exist for the other, truly for the other, right? And what he means by that, of course, is the white other, right? So the white gaze isn't there. Does that mean, though, and this is really, I think, where we get to the point, does that mean that this society does not exist and is not structured in reference to the fundamental third term, which is whiteness? No, right? So you could be outside of the white gaze and rebellion is still necessary. What happens in that kind of a society is the rebellion is in some ways harder to mount, right? The parameters are unclear. You have what Fanon will see throughout this book as a kind of false universalism, where we've apparently overcome or escaped from blackness, right? If you mean outside of the white gaze in the sense that whiteness is no longer the term, then rebellion becomes a very, very different question. Is there a revolutionary function to the explosion, and how does that connect with, and does Fanon discuss repair? Yes, 100%, right? And if anything, this sort of connects to what we were talking about earlier. If anything, the explosion is, and this is what I try to lay out in the structure, it's the precondition, right? It's a pre-dialectical explosion. Meaning, dialectics, two things in conflict with each other. Fanon says, well, I can't even be in conflict with a white person because they don't recognize me as worthy of conflict. I explode, now maybe there can be a conflict, right? That's why he says the battlefield had been drawn up. That's why he's excited about the possibility of struggle, because it's the explosion that paves the way and creates the possibility of that struggle. So yes, the function is the possibility of struggle. For Fanon, that is intimately connected to the question of repair, but in very, very complicated ways. He's a thinker that, despite all of his sort of universalizing generosity toward the world, which we'll see also in the conclusion, foregrounds the question of struggle in ways that are connected to this critique of Sartre as well. The struggle is now, we're engaged in the struggle. Repair is deferred. Universal reconciliation is deferred. He's going to say very clearly in the beginning of The Wretched of the Earth, we are not trying to have a reunification with our enemies. We're not trying to dialectically reconcile with the colonizer, right? We're trying to expel them or bury them deep in the earth, right? So that's to say repair is deferred. Now, deferred in the sense of that dialectical opposition. That doesn't mean that repair within the side that is engaged in a struggle, it doesn't matter, right? And again, this sort of brings us back to one of the original framings that I had offered, which is that Fanon is no friend. You know, he's understood as sort of loving violence or being sort of obsessed with violence, but he knows more than anyone else the kind of repair that's necessary. But what he's discovered as a psychiatrist, right, as someone whose professional work is to do repair, is that you can't actually repair people and put them back into a sick world, right? He continues to do both, though, right? When he engages in revolutionary struggle, he's also working with individuals, right? He's also trying to help individuals engage in the world in that kind of way. Do we have time for one quick question? 657. Yeah, we'll take this one last one right here in the front.
I was just thinking about like we were talking about with the explosion that we were talking about, and I was just wondering, like you mentioned the rupture of the earth, and I was just wondering if the explosion like we're talking about in this book is similar to the violence he mentions in his On Violence essay of the rupture of the earth, or if there's a kind of difference in if his ideology about those things evolved in between the two books.
That is such a good question, my God. I'm really loving these questions, and I'm so glad that we got to it. Because on the one hand, yes, like I've sort of just sketched out the way that they're kind of similar, but the context is very different, right? Fanon, and you'll get to this a bit in the next, conversation about chapter 7, where he's laying out, specifically the barriers that he's up against in the present, right? This book is written, again, about his experience as a black person in France, which is an ostensibly free society. Slavery has apparently been abolished. People apparently exist as equal citizens under the law, but he knows that that's not true, right? In a sense, this is like sort of like this book was written for like the Obama era of like post-racial politics, where people were acting as if we had overcome, the barriers of the past. That's to say, it's written in a context of false universalism, right? We have overcome race, we're all equals. This false universalism is constituted by equal rights, right? Formal liberal inclusion within a liberal order, which says, because we measure equality by individual access to these certain rights, therefore we've all acquired that and gained it, right? The struggle for Fanon in this book is therefore, how do you start revolutionary motion? And that's why the explosion is necessary, right? That's why it's more necessary. What we'll find in The Wretched of the Earth is a very different dynamic, right? Things are at the breaking point already. As he puts it, the guns go off by themselves, right? Violence is atmospheric. There's no need to sort of jumpstart this dialectical struggle because it's already moving, right? The parameters are already clear. So certainly there are many shared pieces, but the contexts are very, very different, and we're going to see how that plays out. Thank you for all these incredible questions. Thanks to everyone in the space, everyone on the stream. Please check out and consider donating to Abolition School, and we will see you all next week for Chapter 7 and the conclusion of Black Skin, White Masks. Thank you.